The sun hammered down on the Wyoming territory, turning the high plains into a vast, shimmering anvil of heat. It was the kind of noon that bleached the color out of the sagebrush and made the horizon dance in watery waves that promised moisture where there was none. Elias Holloway drove the post-hole digger into the baked earth, the impact vibrating up his arms and settling into the deep ache of his shoulders. The ground fought back. It had been fighting back for 3 years now, ever since the rain stopped coming and the sky turned into a sheet of blue iron. Elias wiped the sweat from his eyes with a forearm stained by soil and grease. He was a man carved from the same hard timber as the fence posts he was setting. His face was a map of weathering, lines etched deep around eyes the color of flint, eyes that had seen the carnage of Antietam and the slow, agonizing death of a family ranch. He was 35, though the mirror in his wash basin told him he was 50. He limped when the weather turned, a souvenir from a Confederate musket ball that had shattered his knee and his youth in one violent instant. He looked out toward the creek bed that marked the southern edge of his property. It was a pitiful thing now, a muddy trickle threading through cracked clay, barely enough to keep his dwindling herd from madness. But something caught his eye in the tall, yellowed grass near the water's edge. It was not a calf, and it was too large to be a coyote. It was a heap of dark fabric, stark against the pale dust. Elias dropped the digger. He reached for the Winchester resting against the wagon wheel, his movements practiced and fluid despite the stiffness in his leg. He walked toward the creek, the dry grass crunching loudly under his boots. The wind kicked up, carrying the scent of dust and heating iron, but beneath it, he smelled something metallic and sharp, blood. When he reached the bank, he stopped. It was a woman. She lay face down in the dirt, one arm thrown out as if reaching for the water she had not quite reached. Her dress, once a fine dark blue muslin, was torn at the hem and coated in grime. Her hair had come loose from its pins, a tangle of chestnuts spilling over her shoulders. Elias lowered the rifle but did not unset the hammer. Trouble had a way of looking innocent in this part of the country until it put a knife in your ribs. He scrambled down the bank, his bad leg protesting the angle. He knelt beside her and turned her over gently. She was alive, but barely. Her skin was pale, translucent against the harsh light, and her lips were cracked and dry, but it was the dark stain on her shoulder that made Elias grimace. A bullet graze. It was shallow. A furrow plowed through the flesh just above the collarbone, but it had bled freely before clotting with the dust. She moaned, a low, ragged sound, and her eyelids fluttered. Elias looked at the horizon. There was no dust cloud, no riders, just the empty, silent plain. He slid his arms under her, lifting her. She was lighter than she looked, thin in the way that spoke of long travel and missed meals. Her head lolled against his chest, damp with fever sweat. He carried her up the bank and toward the ranch house, a rough-hewn log structure that leaned slightly into the prevailing wind, stubborn and solitary. Inside, the cabin was cool and smelled of wood smoke and coffee. He laid her on his own bunk, the quilt rough beneath her silk and lace. He moved quickly then, driven by the muscle memory of a soldier who had patched up worse than this in muddy tents while cannons shook the earth. He stoked the fire in the stove, boiled water in the kettle, and found a clean strip of linen in his sea chest. When the wet cloth touched the wound on her shoulder, she gasped and thrashed, her eyes flying open. They were green, startlingly bright in her pale face, and wide with terror. She scrambled backward, pressing herself against the log wall, her breath coming in short, terrified rasps. "Easy," Elias said, his voice raspy from disuse. He held up his hands, palms open. "You are safe. You are on the Holloway Ranch." She stared at him, her chest heaving. She looked at the door, then at the rifle leaning by the hearth, and finally, back at him. She did not look like the women from the town, with their hard faces and practical calico. She looked like something broken off from a different world, jagged and out of place. "Water," she whispered. The word was a croak. Elias fetched a tin cup from the bucket and handed it to her. She drank greedily. water spilling down her chin. Her hands shaking so badly he had to reach out and steady the cup. When it was empty, she slumped back against the pillows, exhaustion claiming her again. "Who shot you?" Elias asked. The fear flared again in her eyes, sharp and immediate. She shook her head. "No," she said. Her voice was stronger now, edged with a steel he had not expected. "No questions. Please." Elias looked at the wound, then at the quality of her dress, and the way her hands were soft, unaccustomed to labor. He knew he should put her in the wagon and take her to the sheriff in town. He knew that harboring a woman with a bullet wound was inviting a storm down on his head. But he looked at the exhaustion etched into her features, the desperation in the set of her jaw. He turned away and tossed the bloody rag into the fire. "Rest." "Then," he said. She slept for 14 hours. Elias spent the time outside, working until the moon rose high and white over the valley. He checked the perimeter of his land twice, watching for tracks, for riders, for anything that might explain the woman in his bed. There was nothing but the coyotes singing to the stars. When he came back inside, she was sitting up. She had found his basin and washed the worst of the dirt from her face. She looked younger now, perhaps 25, though her eyes held the wariness of someone much older. "I cannot pay you," she said the moment he walked through the door. Elias hung his hat on the peg. "I did not ask for payment. I cannot stay for free," she insisted. She tried to stand but swayed, clutching the bedpost. "I can work, I can cook, I can mend. I just need a few days. 3 days. Then I will be gone." Elias looked at her. "You can barely stand." "Ma'am, I will manage." Her chin went up. A stubbornness radiated from her that he recognized. It was the same stubbornness that kept him fixing fences on a ranch that yielded nothing but dust. 3 days, Elias said. "You can sleep in the bunkhouse out back. It is empty. There has not been a crew here since the war." "Thank you," she said. Her shoulders sagged with relief. "I am Clara, Elias Holloway," he replied. The next morning, Clara Monroe kept her word. Despite the stiffness in her shoulder and the limp that mirrored his own fatigue, she was up before dawn. When Elias came out of the main cabin, he found a pot of coffee boiling over a small fire she had built outside the bunkhouse. She was sitting on a stump, mending the tear in her dress with a needle and thread she must have carried in her pocket. She offered him a cup without a word. He took it, the metal hot against his calloused fingers. The coffee was strong, black and bitter, just the way he liked it. They worked in silence that day. Elias repaired the roof of the barn, stripping away rotten shingles and nailing down fresh ones. Clara swept out the bunkhouse, scrubbed the floors, and then took to the small vegetable garden that Elias had all but abandoned. She pulled weeds with a ferocity that suggested she was fighting something other than nature. Elias watched her from the roof. He saw how she paused every now and then to touch her shoulder, how she wiped sweat from her brow with the back of a trembling hand. But she never stopped. There was a mystery to her, a tension that hung around her like static electricity before a lightning strike. She was hiding. That much was plain. But in the West, everyone was hiding from something. The law, a debt, a memory, or just the silence of their own failures. At midday, they shared a meal of hardtack and dried beef on the porch. The air was thick and still, the heat pressing down like a heavy wool blanket. "You have a limp," Clara observed. It was not a question, just a statement of fact. Elias chewed slowly, looking out over the brown expanse of the valley. "Gettysburg?" He lied. It was easier than explaining the border skirmishes and the brother he had lost in a muddy field not 10 miles from here. "You handle a rifle like a soldier," she added. "And you handle a silence like a poker player," he countered. A faint smile touched her lips, gone as quickly as it came. "It is a necessary skill. Mr. Holloway, Elias, she corrected. She looked down at her hands, which were already reddening from the sun and the work. "Why are you here alone? A place this size, it requires men, it requires life. It has me." Elias said, "It is dying," she said softly. "The land is thirsty. The house is lonely." Elias stiffened. He set his plate down on the railing. It is surviving. That is all that matters. She looked at him then. Really looked at him. Her green eyes searching the crags of his face. Is it? Or are you just waiting for it to finally give up so you can too? Elias stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loud against the wood. The water trough needs filling, he said, and walked away. He felt her gaze on his back, heavy and knowing. By the third day, the heat broke, but not in the way the land needed. The sky turned a bruised purple in the west, piling up clouds that looked like bruised knuckles. The wind shifted, turning cold and sharp, whipping the dust into blinding swirls. A dry storm was coming, or perhaps a deluge. In this country, the weather offered no promises, only threats. Elias was in the barn checking the horses when the first crack of thunder shook the ground. It sounded like artillery fire, deep and resonant in his chest. He calmed the mare, stroking her nose, and then looked out the barn door. The sky had opened up. Rain was falling in sheets, violent and gray, hammering the earth with enough force to bruise. He saw Clara standing in the doorway of the bunkhouse. The structure was old, the roof patchy. It would not hold against a storm like this. "Get to the cabin!" he shouted over the roar of the wind. She hesitated, hugging her arms around herself. "Now!" Elias yelled. He grabbed a canvas tarp and ran toward her, his bad leg dragging in the mud that was instantly forming. He reached her just as a bolt of lightning split the sky, illuminating her pale, frightened face in a stark flash of white. He threw the tarp over her shoulders and guided her toward the main house, his hand firm on her back. They tumbled into the cabin, dripping wet and breathless. The fire Elias had banked earlier was still warm. He added logs quickly, the flames leaping up to chase away the sudden gloom. The rain drummed against the roof, a deafening rhythm that isolated them from the rest of the world. "You are soaking wet," Elias said. "So are you," Clara replied. Her dress clung to her frame, revealing the sharpness of her collarbones and the curve of her waist. She shivered, her teeth chattering. Elias turned his back to give her privacy. "Wrap yourself in the quilt from the bed. I will hang these by the fire." When he turned back, she was bundled in his patchwork quilt, sitting by the hearth. She looked small, almost childlike, but her eyes were dark with adult worries. Elias set a pot of beans and salt pork on the stove. It was humble fare, but it was hot. They ate sitting on the floor by the fire, the table feeling too formal, too distant. The storm raged outside, wind howling around the corners of the cabin like a mournful ghost. "Why do you stay?" Clara asked again. Her voice was quiet, barely audible over the rain. "You got angry when I asked before, but I need to know. Why stay in a place that ghosts have already claimed?" Elias stared into the fire, the flames reflected in his eyes, orange and dancing. He thought of his brother, Samuel. He thought of the day the railroad men came, the day the survey lines were drawn, the argument that turned into a shouting match, and the shouting match that ended with Samuel in the dirt, blood pooling around his head. He thought of the justice that never came, the sheriff who looked the other way, the silence that had descended on the ranch like a shroud. "My brother died on that ridge to the east," Elias said, his voice low. "He is buried under the cottonwood tree by the dry creek. If I leave, the railroad takes the land. They take the house. They take the dirt that covers him." Clara stopped eating. She set her bowl down. "I promised him," Elias continued. "I promised I would hold it, even if it dries up and blows away. I have to be here to watch it go. Someone has to stay and remember." The silence stretched between them, heavy with grief. Clara shifted, the quilt slipping slightly from her shoulder. She looked at the fire, her expression twisting with a pain that mirrored his own. "I understand," she whispered. "To run is to forget, and to forget is the worst kind of betrayal." "You are running," Elias said. It was not an accusation. Clara closed her eyes. "Yes." "I am running from a man who thinks he owns the world, a man who thinks that because he has gold, he can buy people like cattle." She took a ragged breath, and, for a moment, Elias thought she would tell him everything. He saw the confession rising in her throat, the weight of it pressing against her lips. He saw her hands clench into fists in the fabric of the quilt. But then she shook her head, pushing the words back down. "It does not matter. He is far away, and I am here. For tonight, at least, the rain hides us both." She looked up at him, and the raw vulnerability in her face hit Elias like a physical blow. She was beautiful, not in the porcelain way of the magazines, but in the way a storm is beautiful, wild, dangerous, and undeniable. "You should not be here," Elias said, his voice rough. "I am not a man who can help you. Clara, I have broken livestock. You are the only thing that has felt solid in a long time," she said. She leaned forward slightly, the firelight catching the curve of her cheek. The air in the cabin shifted. It became thin, charged, vibrating with the same tension that had been building between them for 3 days. Elias felt his heart hammer against his ribs. He wanted to reach out and touch her face, to trace the line of her jaw, to smooth the worry from her brow. The urge terrified him. Clara seemed to sense his fear. A sad, crooked smile touched her lips. She leaned closer, her gaze dropping to his mouth. "Just one kiss, no more," she whispered, trying to make it sound light, trying to make it a joke to break the heaviness, "just to see if we are both still alive." Elias stared at her. He should have pulled away. He should have stood up and walked out into the rain. He was a man of discipline, a man who had denied himself comfort for years as penance for sins he could not wash away. But when she tilted her head, her eyes half closing, he found that he could not move. He was a drowning man, and she was the only air left in the world. He leaned in. Their lips met. It was not the sweeping, practiced kiss of the romance novels his mother used to read. It was tentative, trembling, tasting of salt pork and desperation. Clara let out a small sound, a whimper in her throat, and her hand came up to grip his forearm. Her fingers were cold, but her mouth was hot. For a second, the world narrowed down to the point of contact. The storm outside ceased to exist. The ranch, the drought, the railroad, the ghosts. It all fell away. There was only the softness of her lips and the sudden, terrifying rush of heat in his blood. Elias pulled back sharply, gasping as if he had been burned. He stared at her, his chest heaving. Clara sat frozen, her eyes wide, her hand still reaching for him. Her lips were parted, red and swollen. Elias stood up, knocking his bowl over. The beans spilled onto the hearth, sizzling as they hit the hot stones. I have to check the stock," he stammered. "Elias," Clara said, her voice shaking. He did not look at her. He grabbed his hat and his oilskin coat, jamming the hat onto his head. He threw the door open. The wind howled, driving rain into the cabin, soaking the floorboards in an instant. Elias stepped out into the storm, pulling the door shut behind him with a slam that rattled the hinges. He stood on the porch for a moment, the rain lashing against his face, mixing with the sweat that had broken out on his brow. His heart was thundering like a runaway train. He walked out into the mud, ignoring the pain in his leg, ignoring the lightning that tore the sky apart. He needed the cold. He needed the noise. He needed to remember who he was, a man alone, a man with a duty to the dead, not a man who could afford to lose himself in the green eyes of a woman running from hell. But as he stood by the corral fence, gripping the rough wood until his knuckles turned white, the taste of her was still on his lips, sweeter than the rain and more dangerous than the drought. The morning sun rose like a judge's gavel, demanding order after the chaos of the storm. The sky was scrubbed clean, a blinding, expansive blue that stretched over the Wyoming plains without a single cloud to soften its glare. The earth was damp for the first time in months, the scent of wet sage and mud thick in the air. But Elias Holloway knew the moisture would not last. The ground was too hard, too scared to drink it in. It would evaporate by noon, leaving the ranch just as thirsty as it had been before. Elias had left the cabin before Clara woke. He moved with the frantic energy of a man trying to outrun his own thoughts. The memory of the kiss burned on his lips, a phantom heat that the cool morning air could not dispel. He felt like a fool. He was a man of discipline, a man who had buried his desires along with his family. Yet one look from a woman with haunted eyes had shattered his resolve like cheap glass. He rode the roan gelding hard to the northern perimeter, where the drift fence had been leaning for a year. He needed to work. He needed to tear his hands on barbed wire and strain his back until the physical pain drowned out the confusion in his chest. He was wrestling a cedar post into the ground, sweat stinging his eyes. When he heard the wagon, he did not look up, hoping it was a neighbor, hoping it was the wind, hoping it was anyone but her. But the wagon stopped, the brake lever creaking loudly. "I told you to rest," Elias said to the post he was hammering. "And I told you I pay my debts," Clara's voice answered. It was calm, devoid of the trembling vulnerability from the night before. Elias straightened, wiping his forehead with his sleeve. Clara sat on the seat of the buckboard wagon he used for hauling feed. She wore a shirt he recognized as one of his own old flannel ones. The sleeves rolled up 5 times to free her hands, and a skirt she must have scrubbed clean in the wash basin. Her hair was braided tight against her head, practical and severe. She looked ridiculous in the oversized clothes, yet undeniably dignified. "I am mending fences," Elias said flatly. "It does not work for a woman with a bullet wound. My shoulder is stiff, not useless," she replied. She climbed down from the wagon, wincing only slightly as her boots hit the mud. "Hand me the wire stretchers." Elias stared at her. "Go back to the house. Clara." She ignored him. She walked to the back of the wagon where he had left the spool of Glidden wire. She grabbed the heavy coil, her small hands struggling for purchase, but she heaved it off the tailgate with a grunt of effort. She dragged it toward him, her boots slipping in the slick grass. "If you are going to be stubborn," Elias said, stepping forward to take the spool before she dropped it on her foot, "you might as well be useful." They worked in silence for the first hour. The work was brutal. The wire was sharp and unforgiving, known in the territory as the devil's rope. It required 3 hands to splice a break, 2 to hold the tension and 1 to wrap the ends. Elias found himself forced into a proximity he had tried to avoid. When he held the stretcher, Clara had to step in close to twist the wire. He could smell the soap she had used, a simple lye scent that suddenly seemed like the most intoxicating perfume in the world. He watched her hands. They were bleeding from small scratches, but she did not complain. She bit her lip, focused, twisting the iron with a grim determination that matched his own. By midday, the sun was a physical weight. They sat in the shadow of the wagon to eat the biscuits and dried beef she had brought. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer the sharp, awkward silence of embarrassed strangers. It was the companionable quiet of 2 people who had sweated over the same impossible task. Elias took a long pull from his canteen and offered it to her. She drank, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. "You work harder than my ranch hands did," Elias said. "Before I let them go." She looked at the endless line of fence posts stretching into the shimmering distance. "Why did you let them go?" "Could not pay them," Elias answered honestly. "The beef prices dropped after '73, then the drought. Then the railroad squeezed the shipping rates until it cost more to move a cow than to shoot it. The railroad," Clara said. The word came out cold. Elias looked at the horizon. "That is right. The Union Pacific. They wanted the water rights to this valley. They said they needed it for a spur line depot. They sent men with papers, and when the papers did not work, they sent men with guns." Clara went very still. She set the canteen down carefully. "Who sent them?" Elias picked up a stone and turned it over in his fingers. "A man named Cornelius Vance, a baron from back east who thinks the territory is his personal chessboard." He heard Clara's breath hitch, a small, sharp intake of air. He looked at her. She was staring at her hands, her face pale beneath the flush of the sun. "You know the name," Elias said. "It was not a question." "Everyone knows the name," she said quickly. Her voice was too high, too brittle. "He owns half the state." Elias threw the stone. It clattered against a fence post. "He wanted it all. My brother, Samuel. He was younger, hot-headed. He rode out to meet the surveyors when they crossed our line. He told them to get off Holloway land." Elias paused. The memory was a dark room he tried not to enter. "And?" Clara prompted softly. And the sheriff said it was self-defense, Elias said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. He said Samuel drew first, but Samuel did not even carry a pistol. He hated guns after the war. The surveyors were paid men, lawmen, they called themselves, but they were on Vance's payroll. They shot him in the chest and left him for the buzzards. Clara made a sound, a stifled cry of pain. She pressed her hand to her mouth. I went to town, Elias continued, staring at the wire. I told the sheriff what I knew. He told me to go home before I had an accident, too. That was 5 years ago. Samuel is on the ground. The railroad built their spur line 20 miles north instead. Samuel died for nothing but a rich man's pride. Clara turned her face away. He saw a tear track through the dust on her cheek. She was trembling. I am sorry, she whispered. I am so sorry. Elias. He looked at her, confused by the depth of her reaction. It was a tragic story. Yes, but the West was paved with them. Her grief seemed personal, sharp, as if the bullet that killed Samuel had grazed her too. It is done, Elias said, standing up and dusting off his trousers. The dead are dead. We have a fence to fix. He offered her a hand to pull her up. She looked at his calloused palm for a long moment before taking it. Her grip was tight, desperate. When he pulled her to her feet, she stumbled slightly, landing against his chest. For a second, neither of them moved. He could feel the rapid beat of her heart against his ribs. He smelled the sun on her hair. He wanted to wrap his arms around her and crush the sadness out of her. But he stepped back, clearing his throat. Work to do, he muttered. That night, the air in the cabin was thick enough to chew. Elias sat by the fire cleaning his Winchester, the rhythmic slide of the oil rag soothing his nerves. Clara sat at the table, mending a tear in his work coat. Every time she moved, the fabric rustled, and Elias felt the sound in his teeth. He found himself watching her. He watched the way the firelight caught the stray hairs escaping her braid. He watched the concentration on her face, the way she bit her bottom lip when the needle snagged. He remembered the taste of her mouth from the night before, the surprising softness, the sudden surrender. He forced his eyes back to the rifle. He was a man of honor. She was a guest, a wounded woman under his protection. He had no right to want her, but the want was there, a dull ache in his belly that was growing sharper by the hour. Clara looked up and caught him staring. Elias froze. He did not look away this time. The air between them crackled. He saw her eyes drop to his hands, to the way his knuckles were white as he gripped the rifle stock. She saw the tension in his jaw, the flush that rose up his neck. She knew. She set the coat down and stood up. I think I will turn in, she said, her voice breathless. Good night, Elias said. He did not look up as she passed him to go out to the bunkhouse, but he listened to her footsteps until the door clicked shut. Then he let out a breath he had been holding for hours and put his head in his hands. The next afternoon brought a different kind of heat. It was a heavy, sullen warmth that promised another storm. Elias and Clara were working near the creek bed, clearing brush that had choked the only path to the water. Clara was pulling at a stubborn knot of sagebrush, her back to him. Elias was sharpening his axe a few yards away. He heard the sound before she did. It was a dry, rhythmic rattle, like seeds shaking in a gourd. It was the sound of death. Clara, Elias shouted. She turned, confused. What? Don't move, he commanded. His voice was low and terrible. Clara froze. She looked down, curled in the shadow of the sagebrush. Not 2 feet from her ankle was a diamondback. It was coiled tight, its head raised, the rattle blurring with speed. It was angry, cornered, and ready to strike. Clara gasped, her instinct to jump back visible in the twitch of her legs. Stay still, Elias said. He moved toward her. He did not run. Sudden movement would trigger the strike. He flowed forward, his bad leg forgotten. Clara was shaking. The snake's head tracked her trembling. Elias was 5 feet away. 4. The snake pulled its head back, the coil tightening like a spring. Elias lunged. He did not go for the snake. He went for Clara. He grabbed her by the waist and the arm, his grip bruisingly hard, and yanked her backward with violent force. The snake struck the empty air where her leg had been a fraction of a second before. Elias swung her around, putting his body between her and the reptile. In one fluid motion, he drew the Colt revolver from his hip and fired. The shot was deafening in the quiet valley. The snake's head exploded, its body thrashing aimlessly in the dust. Silence rushed back in, ringing in their ears. Elias holstered the gun, his heart hammering. He turned to Clara. "Are you hit? Did it get you?" He reached for her, his hands still gripping her shoulders to steady her. "Don't!" Clara screamed. She wrenched herself away from him, stumbling back. Her eyes were wide with a terror that had nothing to do with the snake. She was looking at his hands. She was looking at the violence in his grip. She was hyperventilating, her chest heaving in ragged, panic-stricken gasps. Elias froze, his hands hovering in the air. "Clara, please," she whimpered. She wrapped her arms around herself, shrinking away from him. Just don't grab me. Please don't grab me like that." Elias lowered his hands slowly. He saw it then. He saw the memory overlaid on her face. She wasn't seeing him. She was seeing someone else. Someone who had grabbed her with that same force, but not to save her. "I am sorry," Elias said gently. "The snake. I had to move you fast." Clara stared at the dead snake, then at Elias. The panic began to ebb, replaced by a deep, crushing shame. She straightened up, brushing the dust from her skirt with trembling hands. "I know," she whispered. "I know you did. I am sorry. I am not used to being protected." She turned and walked rapidly toward the house, not waiting for him. Elias watched her go, the dead snake twisting in the dirt at his feet. He felt a cold fury rising in him. Not at her, but at the man who had put that look in her eyes. That night, the moon was a sliver of bone in the sky. They sat on the porch, the darkness stretching out before them. Elias smoked a pipe, the tobacco smoke drifting lazily in the still air. Clara sat on the steps, hugging her knees. "You asked me why I ran," she said into the darkness. Elias did not look at her. "You do not have to tell me. I want to," she said. She took a deep breath. "I was engaged. It was an arrangement. Really. My father was a preacher who believed that money was a sign of God's favor. He promised me to a man who had a lot of it." Elias waited. "His name is Charles." She said, "Charles Vance." Elias bit down on the stem of his pipe. The name hit him like a physical blow. Vance, the son of Cornelius Vance, the son of the man who killed his brother. The world suddenly felt very small and very cruel. He is a cruel man," Clara continued, her voice wavering. "He liked to own things, horses, land, people. When we were together, he would hold me so tight it left bruises. He said it was because he loved me so much he couldn't let go. But it wasn't love, it was possession." She rubbed her arm, the spot where Elias had grabbed her earlier. "I tried to leave," she said. "I packed a bag. I took nothing that he gave me, no jewelry, no money, just my own clothes. But he caught me. He told the sheriff I had stolen $5,000 in gold bonds from his safe. He lied." Elias said, "Of course he lied," Clara said bitterly. "But he is Vance. His lie is the law." "I ran. I got on a horse and I rode until the animal collapsed. Then I walked. His men found me near the creek. One of them shot at me. I think they meant to kill me. Charles would rather see a thing broken than see it free." She turned to look at him. Her face was pale in the starlight. "So you see, Elias, I am not just a runaway. I am a thief in the eyes of the law. If you keep me here, you are harboring a criminal, and worse, you are crossing the Vances again." Elias sat in silence for a long time. The pipe had gone out. He tapped the ash against his boot heel. He thought of Samuel. He thought of the fence line. He thought of the way Clara had looked at him when he pulled her from the snake. Terror, followed by a dawning realization that his hands were safe. He stood up and walked to the railing. He looked out at the dark shape of the cottonwood tree where his brother was buried. "You can stay here," he said. His voice was low, rumbling like distant thunder. "Elias, You don't understand. I understand. He cut her off. I understand that the Vances have taken enough from this valley. They took my brother. They tried to take my land. They will not take you. He turned to face her. You stay, Clara. As long as you need. You don't owe me a damn thing. Not work, not money, and certainly not fear. Clara looked up at him, her eyes shining with tears she refused to shed. She stood up slowly. She walked up the steps until she was standing right in front of him. The next night, the tension finally snapped. It had been building all day. A pressure behind the eyes, a tightness in the chest. They were in the cabin. Elias was washing dishes in the basin. Clara was drying. Their hands brushed as he handed her a plate. The contact sent a jolt through him that made him drop the tin plate. It clattered loudly on the floor. Neither of them bent to pick it up. Elias looked at her. Clara was looking at him, her eyes dark and dilated. She wasn't frightened. Not anymore. She looked hungry. She looked like she was standing on the edge of a cliff and deciding whether to jump. Clara, Elias warned, his voice rough. Do not look at me like that. Like what? She whispered. Like I am water. He said, I am thirsty. Elias. She stepped closer. She reached out and placed her hand on his chest, right over his heart. He could feel the heat of her palm through his shirt. He could feel his own heart slamming against her hand. Clara, no, he groaned. I am too old. I am too broken. I have nothing to give you but dust and a hard life. You saved my life, she said. You saved me from the snake. You saved me from the storm. Saved me from the cold. Elias. She gripped his shirt and pulled him down. This time, he did not freeze. He resisted for a heartbeat, a final frantic attempt to hold on to his solitude. But then the dam broke. He made a low sound in his throat and wrapped his arms around her. He pulled her into him, lifting her slightly off the floor. His mouth crashed down on hers. It was not a gentle kiss, it was a collision. It was the unleashing of years of loneliness, years of anger, years of sleeping in a cold bed. It was desperate and fierce. Clara met him with equal force, her hands tangling in his hair, her body molding against his. They stumbled backward, knocking into the table. Elias didn't care. He kissed her jaw, her throat, the pulse that beat wildly at the base of her neck. He felt her hands seeking, pulling at his shirt, touching the skin he had hidden from the world for so long. They fell into each other like they had waited their whole lives for this specific collision of souls. It was slow and breathless, a frantic shedding of defenses. He carried her to the bed, the quilt rough beneath them. But neither noticed. The world outside ceased to exist. There was no railroad, no drought, no brother in the grave. There was only the firelight, the sound of their breathing, and the incredible, impossible warmth of her skin against his. Later, the fire had died down to embers. The room was cooling, but under the quilt, it was warm. Elias lay on his back, staring at the ceiling beams. Clara was curled against his side, her head resting on his shoulder, her hand flat on his chest. He felt a profound sense of peace he had not known was possible. But beneath it, the fear was already creeping back. He had something to lose now. He had something precious. And, in his experience, precious things were always taken away. Clara stirred. She traced the scar on his shoulder with her finger. Elias? She whispered. You weren't supposed to make me feel safe, she said softly. Her voice was thick with sleep and emotion. I was supposed to keep running. You were just a stop on the map. You weren't supposed to be the destination. Elias couldn't answer. The lump in his throat was too large. He simply turned his head and pressed a kiss to her forehead, inhaling the scent of her. He pulled the quilt tighter around them, his arm tightening around her waist like a band of iron. He held her as if the sheer force of his grip could keep the morning and the world at bay. The change did not happen all at once, but rather like the turning of a season, subtle at first, then undeniable. The ranch, which had for so long been a skeleton of gray wood and silence, began to grow skin and muscle again. It started with the smell. For years, the air inside the main cabin had smelled of stale coffee, gun oil, and the dry dust that sifted through the chinks in the logs. Now, it smelled of yeast. Clara had found a sack of flour in the pantry, weevil-free by some miracle, and she had coaxed a starter to life. The scent of baking bread greeted Elias when he came in from the pastures, a warm, living aroma that made his stomach clench with a hunger that was not entirely about food. She did not stop at the kitchen. She attacked the front porch with a hammer and a pocketful of nails she had scavenged from the barn. The railing, which had hung loose like a broken tooth since '69, was suddenly firm. She swept the accumulated grit from the planks until the wood grain showed through, amber and weathered, near the water pump, where the ground was usually a muddy slurry. She had cleared a patch of earth and planted seeds she found in a jar on the mantel. They were old seeds, wrinkled and dry, but she watered them every evening with religious devotion. Elias watched her from a distance as he worked the cattle. He watched her move between the house and the pump, her skirts kicking up small clouds of dust, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows. She was no longer the fragile, broken thing he had pulled from the creek. She was becoming the spine of the place. The cattle needed water and grass, but the ranch, the soul of it, needed her. He realized with a jolt of terror that he was beginning to structure his day not around the sun, but around the moments he would see her. One afternoon in late July, the heat lay over the valley like a heavy wool blanket. The air was still, filled with the droning of cicadas. Elias had been riding since dawn, checking the herd in the north pasture. He rode back toward the house, his shirt sticking to his back, the taste of salt on his lips. As he crossed the ridge that overlooked the creek, he pulled the roan gelding to a halt. Below him, in a bend of the stream where the cottonwoods offered a pool of shade, Clara was bathing. She thought she was alone. The ranch was miles from the nearest neighbor, and Elias was supposed to be gone until supper. She stood waist-deep in the slow-moving water, her back to him. Her skin was stark white against the dark green of the water and the shadows of the trees. She had piled her hair on top of her head, but stray tendrils clung to her damp neck. She moved slowly, splashing water over her shoulders, scrubbing her arms with a cloth. Elias sat on his horse, motionless. His first instinct, bred from years of gentlemanly expectation, was to turn the horse and ride away. To look was a violation, but he did not turn. He could not. He watched the way the light filtered through the leaves and dappled her back. He watched the curve of her waist and the slope of her hip as she turned slightly. It was not the leering gaze of a predator, but the starving look of a man who had forgotten what beauty looked like. Clara paused. She went very still in the water. She did not turn around, but her head tilted slightly, listening. She knew he was there. The realization hit Elias hard. She knew he was watching, and she did not cover herself. She did not scream. She stood there, letting the water lap against her skin, allowing him to see her scars and her softness. It was a permission granted without words, an intimacy far sharper than the act of undressing in the dark. Elias swallowed hard, his throat dry. He turned the horse slowly, guiding it back over the ridge, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. When he came into the house an hour later, Clara was already dressed, her hair drying by the fire. They did not speak of it, but the air between them had shifted again, thick with a new, unspoken understanding. That evening, they sat on the newly repaired porch. The sun was setting in a bruise of purple and orange, casting long, distorted shadows across the yard. Elias whittled at a piece of cedar, the knife shucking off curled strips of wood. Clara sat in the rocking chair, her hands idle in her lap for once. "You are quiet tonight," she said. "I am thinking," Elias replied. "About what? About the war," he said. He. The truth slipped out before he could catch it. He never spoke of the war. Not the blood, not the noise, not the terrible waste of it. Clara stopped rocking. "What about it?" Elias set the wood down. "I told you I hurt my leg at Gettysburg. That was true, but I did not tell you what happened after. When I came home," he looked at his hands. They were large, scarred, capable of building fences and capable of breaking things. I was in a saloon in Cheyenne, Elias said, his voice low and rough. It was 66. The war was over, but the hate was not. There was a man there, a driver from Ohio. He had had too much whiskey. He started talking about the Rebs, about how we were traitors, how we deserved to starve. Elias paused, listening to the coyotes yipping in the distance. He said something about my mother. Elias continued. He said she raised a brood of cowards. I hit him. I hit him until he went down. And then I kept hitting him. I broke his jaw. I broke his ribs. I beat him until his face didn't look like a face anymore. He looked up at Clara. Her eyes were fixed on him, wide and dark. The sheriff pulled me off, Elias said. He knew me. He knew my family. He told me to get out of town and never come back. The man lived, I think, but he was never the same. And neither was I. I realized then that the war hadn't just taken my knee. It had taken the part of me that knew when to stop. He waited for her to flinch. He waited for the look of disgust. The judgment that a preacher's daughter should surely have for a man capable of such blind violence. Clara leaned forward. She reached out and covered his hand with hers. Her fingers were cool against his feverish skin. You were angry, she said softly. You were grieving. I was an animal, Elias corrected. No, she said firmly. You were a man in pain, and pain makes us do terrible things. She squeezed his hand. I told you about Charles, about how he hurt me. But I didn't tell you what I did before I left. I smashed his favorite portrait, the one of himself that hung in the hallway. I took a fireplace poker and I destroyed it. I wanted to destroy him. If he had been standing there, I might have done it. Does that make me an animal? Elias? No, Elias said immediately. It makes you a survivor. Then grant yourself the same mercy, she whispered. The forgiveness in her voice was a balm he had not expected. He turned his hand over and interlaced his fingers with hers. They sat there as the dark swallowed the valley, two broken people holding on to each other in the vast, indifferent night. 2 nights later, the silence was shattered by a scream. It was a high, thin sound of pure terror that cut through the heavy timber of the cabin walls. Elias was awake before his eyes opened. He rolled out of bed, his feet hitting the cold floorboards, his hand already closing around the stock of the Winchester leaning against the wall. He did not think. He ran. He burst out of the main house and across the yard to the bunkhouse, ignoring the sharp stones biting into his bare feet. He kicked the door open, the rifle raised, ready to kill whatever intruder had dared to touch her. The bunkhouse was empty of men. There was only Clara, sitting bolt upright in the narrow bed, her hands clawing at the sheets, her chest heaving. She was screaming, a wordless, sobbing sound that tore at his heart. Elias lowered the rifle and rushed to her. Clara! Clara! Wake up! She flailed at him, her eyes blind with nightmare. No, no, don't take me! Charles, please! It is Elias, he said, dropping the gun and grabbing her shoulders. He shook her, hard. It is Elias. You are safe, she gasped, her eyes focusing on his face. For a second, the terror held, and then she crumpled. She threw herself forward, wrapping her arms around his bare torso, burying her face in his neck. She was shaking so hard her teeth chattered. He found me, she sobbed into his skin. In the dream, he found me. He had the dogs. He had the chains. Elias wrapped his arms around her, pulling her tight against him. He could feel her tears hot on his shoulder. He stroked her hair, his own heart slowly returning to a normal rhythm. He is not here, Elias murmured, his voice a rumble in his chest. There are no dogs. There are no chains. There is only me. Don't send me back, she begged, her voice cracking. Promise me you won't send me back. I would rather die. Elias, I would rather you shoot me right here than let him take me back. I promise, Elias said fiercely. He pressed his cheek against the top of her head. I will never let him take you. I will put a bullet in him before I let him touch you again. She clung to him, her fingers digging into the muscle of his back. He held her until the shaking stopped, until her breathing slowed to a hitching rhythm. He stayed there, sitting on the edge of the bunk, holding her while the moon tracked across the floorboards. He realized then that he would burn the whole territory down if it meant keeping her safe. But the world outside the ranch had a way of intruding, no matter how high the fences were built. It arrived on a Tuesday, in the saddlebag of a passing neighbor, Old Man Miller, who had ridden out from town with supplies. He stopped at the gate, tipping his hat to Elias. "Got a letter for you, Elias," Miller said, handing over a folded piece of paper sealed with wax, "and some news. Sheriff says there's a reward out, big money." Elias felt a cold stone drop in his stomach. "What kind of reward?" $500, Miller said, whistling low. "For a runaway, a woman. Says she stole bonds from a railroad tycoon back east. They say she might be headed this way. Have you seen anyone?" Elias looked Miller in the eye. His face was a mask of stone. "I haven't seen a soul in weeks." "Miller, just you and the cows." Miller nodded, scratching his beard. "Well, keep an eye out. $500 is a lot of money for a man in a drought." Miller rode off, leaving a cloud of dust hanging in the still air. Elias stood by the gate, the letter heavy in his hand. He broke the seal. It wasn't a letter from a friend. It was a handbill, folded tight. It featured a sketch, a crude likeness, but undeniable. It was Clara, and beneath it, the promise of gold from the estate of Charles Vance. Elias walked back to the house, his limp more pronounced than usual. He found Clara in the kitchen, kneading dough. She looked up, a smile touching her lips, but it vanished when she saw his face. "What is it?" she asked. Elias laid the handbill on the table. Clara looked at it. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She went very pale, the blood draining from her face until she looked like a statue made of salt. She reached out and touched the paper, her flour-dusted finger tracing the words thief and whore, printed in bold type. "They know," she whispered. Miller brought it. Elias said, "He didn't know it was you, but he will. Eventually, someone will see you. Someone will talk. $500 turns good men into Judas." Clara wiped her hands on her apron. Her movements were jerky, mechanical. "I have to go." "No," Elias said. "I have to go tonight," she said, her voice rising. "I can take the mare. I will ride west, toward the mountains. If I leave now, I can draw them away from you." "You will die in the mountains," Elias said calmly. "Winter is coming early. You know that. I don't care." She spun around to face him. "Do you see what this is, Elias? This is a war declaration. Charles isn't just looking for me. He is hunting me. If they find me here, they will destroy you. They will burn this house. They will hang you for aiding a fugitive." "Let them try," Elias snarled. "You are being a fool," Clara shouted. She grabbed a saddlebag from the hook by the door and started shoving tins of food into it. "I will not drag you down with me. I will not be the reason you lose this land." Elias crossed the room in 2 strides. He grabbed the bag from her hands and threw it into the corner. It hit the wall with a heavy thud. "You are not leaving," he said. "Stop protecting me," Clara yelled, pushing against his chest. "Why are you doing this? Look at me, Elias. Look at what the paper says. That is what the world thinks I am. A thief, a fallen woman." "I don't care what the world thinks," Elias shouted back. "You should." She was crying now, angry, hot tears. "You are a rancher. You are a man of honor. You have a name. I am just ruined. That is all I am to them. Spoiled goods. A rich man's plaything who ran away. You can't wash that off. Elias, you can't fix a fence and make me new again." Elias grabbed her wrists. He pulled her close, forcing her to look at him. Her eyes were wild, desperate. "I am not trying to make you new," he said, his voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "I don't want new things. I want you." He saw the shock register on her face. "You think you are ruined?" Elias asked, shaking her slightly. "You think you are broken? Look at me. Clara, look at this leg. Look at this dead land. Look at the blood on my hands. I am just as ruined as you are. We are both wreckage." Clara stared at him, her breath catching in her throat. "But you are good. I am not good," Elias said. "I am a man who has been waiting to die for 5 years, until you walked out of that creek." He let go of her wrists and cupped her face in his hands. His thumbs brushed away the tears on her cheeks. "If they come, let them come," he said. "But you are not leaving. I chose you. I choose this." Clara let out a sob, a sound of surrender. She threw her arms around his neck, pulling him down. This time, there was no hesitation, no gentle testing of the waters. She kissed him with a desperate hunger, a need to be consumed. Elias lifted her up. She wrapped her legs around his waist, and he carried her to the bedroom. They did not bother with the fire. The heat between them was enough. They made love with a ferocity that bordered on pain. It was not the sweet, tentative coupling of their first night. This was a claim. It was a defiance of the law, of the railroad, of the past that tried to strangle them. Elias worshipped her body with his hands in his mouth, touching every scar, every curve, silently promising that he would stand between her and hell itself. Clara met him measure for measure, her nails digging into his shoulders, her voice crying out his name in the dark. It was an act of rebellion. It was an act of survival, in the friction of their skin. They were writing a new law for themselves, one that Charles Vance and his money could not touch. When it was over, they lay tangled in the sheets, sweat cooling on their skin. The room was silent, save for the wind rattling the window pane. Elias ran his hand down the length of her back, feeling the steady rhythm of her breathing. Clara rested her head on his chest. She traced the line of his jaw, her fingers trembling slightly. "They will come, Elias," she whispered. "They will come, and they will see what I am. They will see what we are." Elias caught her hand and kissed the knuckles, one by one. He stared up into the darkness, his eyes hard and clear. "Then let them see us both as ruined," he said. He pulled her tighter against him, defying the dawn that would bring the wolves to their door. The journey to Bitter Creek was a silent procession of two. The wagon rattled over the hard-packed ruts of the trail, kicking up a fine, choking powder that coated the back of Elias's throat. He kept the horses at a steady, grueling pace, his eyes scanning the horizon where the heat haze shimmered like a mirage. Beside him, Clara sat with her spine stiff against the wooden seat, her hands folded in her lap to hide the trembling she could not control. She wore a bonnet pulled low, shadowing her face. But Elias knew she was watching the road with the same intensity he was. They were running, even if they were moving toward town. They needed supplies. The high country was unforgiving in late autumn, and if they intended to vanish into the mountains before the snow fell, they needed more than hope and a half-empty sack of flour. They needed ammunition, cured meat, heavy wool, and grain for the horses. It was a risk to ride into town, but starvation was a certainty if they did not. Bitter Creek emerged from the dust like a collection of bleached bones scattered on the valley floor. It was a town held together by spitting nails and stubbornness. A single main street flanked by weathered storefronts with false fronts that fooled no one. As the wagon rolled past the first few houses, Elias felt the atmosphere shift. It was usually a noisy place, filled with the clamor of the blacksmith's hammer and the shouting of drovers. Today, it was quiet. The silence was heavy, watchful. A woman sweeping her porch stopped and leaned on her broom, her eyes tracking them. Two men sitting on a bench outside the livery stable ceased their conversation, their heads turning in unison as the wagon passed. Elias did not look at them, but he felt their gazes crawling over his skin. He felt the weight of the handbill that must have been nailed to the post office wall. "Keep your head down," Elias murmured, the words barely audible over the creak of the wheels. Clara nodded, shrinking further into her shawl. Elias pulled the wagon up in front of the general store. He set the brake and wrapped the reins around the hitching post. He reached for his rifle, sliding it from the scabbard. He never walked into town with a long gun, but today the rules of civility had been suspended. He offered a hand to Clara, helping her down. Her grip was damp, her palms sweating against his. "Stay close to me," he said. They entered the store. The bell above the door chimed, a cheerful sound that seemed grotesquely out of place. The interior was dim, smelling of pickle brine, leather, and stale tobacco. Horace, the proprietor, was behind the counter, weighing a sack of sugar. He looked up, a smile forming on his face, but it died the moment he saw Clara. Horace cleared his throat, his eyes darting to the back room and then back to Elias. He wiped his hands on his apron. A nervous, jerky motion. "Elias, haven't seen you in a month. We need supplies." "Horace," Elias said, his voice flat. "Salt pork, 50 pounds of flour, coffee, beans, and 4 boxes of 44 cartridges." Horace hesitated. He looked at Clara, then back at Elias. His gaze lingered on the rifle in Elias's hand. "That is a tall order. Elias, you got the coin?" Elias reached into his pocket and slapped 3 gold eagles on the counter. The sound was loud in the quiet room. It was most of what he had left. The savings from 5 years of selling scrawny cattle. "Is that enough?" Elias asked. Horace stared at the gold. "It is." He did not move to take it. "Elias, you shouldn't be here." "Why is that?" Horace lowered his voice. "The sheriff, he has been asking around, and there are others. Riders came through yesterday, asking about a woman." Elias felt the muscles in his back coil. "What kind of riders?" "Railroad men," Horace whispered. "Fancy suits, hard eyes. They put money on the bar at the saloon. A lot of money. Pack the supplies." "Horace," Elias commanded. "Put them in the wagon. Fast." He turned to watch the street through the dusty front window. The town was waking up to their presence. A small crowd had gathered near the livery. He saw Sheriff Thorne walking toward the store, his thumbs hooked in his gun belt. Thorne was a man Elias had known for 10 years. They had drunk whiskey together. They had ridden in the same posse once. But Thorne was a man who liked his comfort, and comfort in this territory was bought with railroad money. Elias stepped out onto the boardwalk, Clara a shadow at his shoulder. Sheriff Thorne stopped 10 feet away, his badge catching the harsh sunlight. He looked tired. His hat was pulled low, and he chewed on a toothpick, shifting it from one side of his mouth to the other. "Afternoon, Elias," Thorne said. "Sheriff?" Elias replied. Thorne looked at Clara. He did not tip his hat. He studied her face, comparing it to the image in his mind. Then he looked back at Elias, shaking his head slowly. "You are making a mistake, son," Thorne said. "A hell of a mistake. We are just buying supplies. Silas, then we are gone." Thorne spat the toothpick into the dust. "It ain't that simple." "Not this time. You got a fugitive standing behind you." "She is no fugitive," Elias said, his voice dropping an octave. "That ain't what the paper says," Thorne countered. He took a step closer. "The paper says she is a thief. Larceny. Grand theft. Says she blackmailed the Vance family. That is a hanging offense if the judge is in a bad mood. She stole nothing," Elias said. Thorne laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Come on, Elias, look at her. You think a woman like that ends up in a place like this because she is a saint? She is a whore who got greedy. She tried to milk the wrong bull, and now she—" The punch happened before Thorne could finish the sentence. Elias moved with a speed that belied his limp. He stepped in and drove his right fist into the center of Thorne's face. There was a sickening crunch of cartilage. Thorne's head snapped back, his hat flying off, and he crumpled to the boardwalk like a sack of wet grain. Blood sprayed across the weathered wood. Clara gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Elias stood over the sheriff, his knuckles split and bleeding. He was breathing hard, a cold, white rage blinding him for a second. He looked at the crowd gathering by the livery. They were silent, shocked. Elias reached down and grabbed Thorne by the lapels, hauling him half upright. Thorne groaned, blood streaming from his nose. "You speak of her again," Elias hissed. "Close to the man's ear, and I will put you in the ground." He let Thorne drop. "Get in the wagon," Elias told Clara, but before they could move, a shot rang out. Dirt kicked up inches from Elias's boot. He spun around, rifle raised. 2 deputies had stepped out from the alleyway beside the saloon, rifles shouldered. "Drop it! Elias!" one of them shouted. Elias looked at them, then at the wagon. He couldn't get to the horses in time. He grabbed Clara's arm and shoved her toward the narrow gap between the general store and the harness shop. "Run!" he roared. They scrambled into the alley. slipping on refuse and mud. Another shot splintered the wood frame of the store window behind them. They ran down the narrow passage, emerging behind the main street into the maze of corrals and outbuildings. "The barn," Elias ordered, pointing to the large, sagging structure behind the saloon. They slipped inside through a side door that hung on leather hinges. The interior was cool and dark, smelling of old hay and horse sweat. Elias barred the door with a heavy plank. He moved to the window, peering through a crack in the siding. He could see men running down the alley, shouting. They were spreading out, surrounding the block. "We are trapped," Clara whispered. Her voice was thin, edged with panic. Elias turned from the window. He checked the load in his rifle. "We are safe for now. They won't rush a dark barn, not when they know I am armed. They will wait." "Wait for what? For the men Horace told us about," Elias said grimly. The afternoon dragged into evening, the shadows in the barn lengthening until they swallowed the corners. Outside, the town settled into a tense standoff. Elias could hear the murmur of voices, the occasional clomp of boots on the boardwalk. But no one approached the barn. They were waiting for the hammer to fall. They sat in the loft, hidden behind bales of alfalfa. It was cold. Elias took off his coat and draped it around Clara's shoulders. She was shivering, but not from the temperature. "Elias," she said into the darkness. He looked at her. She was barely visible, just a pale shape in the gloom. "You have to give me up," she said. Elias did not answer immediately. He reloaded the magazine of his rifle, pressing the brass cartridges in one by one. "No, please," she begged, reaching out to touch his arm. "Listen to me. You punched the sheriff. You are aiding a fugitive. If you walk out there with me, they will hang you. If you say you found me, if you say I forced you, maybe they will let you keep the ranch." "At the ranch," Elias scoffed softly. "The ranch is dead dirt. Clara, it is your home." "It was a graveyard," he corrected. "Until you came." He set the rifle down and turned to her. He took her face in his hands. His palms were rough, his knuckles swollen and bruised from the punch. "You are not listening to me," he said intensely and quietly. "You think this is about doing a good deed? You think I am some knight from a storybook? I am a selfish man. Clara, I am keeping you because I cannot breathe without you. But I am poison." She wept. "Look what I have brought you. Violence, danger." Elias shook his head. "You brought me life. I was a ghost walking around in a dead man's clothes. You woke me up." He leaned his forehead against hers. "You ain't someone I found. Clara, you are someone I chose, and I do not unchoose the things I love. Not for a sheriff, not for a railroad, not for God himself." Clara fell silent. She leaned into him, her tears wetting his shirt. They sat there for a long time, listening to the wind rattle the loose shingles on the roof. "Tell me," she whispered after a while. "Tell me about the place." Elias closed his eyes. He knew what she meant. It was a game they had started playing in the dark nights at the ranch, a way to pretend the world wasn't closing in. "It is a valley," he began, his voice low and steady. "High up, near the Wind River Range. There is no road to get there, only a deer trail. The grass is belly-high on a horse and green even in August. Is there water?" she asked, her voice trembling. "A spring," he said, "cold and clear. It comes right out of the rock. It never dries up. We will build a cabin there. Cedar logs, a stone chimney, and flowers everywhere. Columbine, Indian paintbrush, bluebells. You won't have to plant them. They just grow wild." Clara let out a shaky breath. "No rail lines. No rail lines," Elias promised. "No telegraphs, no handbills. Just the mountains and the sky." "I'm afraid to believe in it," she whispered. "It sounds like heaven, and I don't think I am allowed in heaven." Elias took her hand. He raised it to his lips. He kissed her knuckles. One by one, the rough skin, the small scars from the work she had done on his land. He kissed them with a reverence he had never shown a Bible. "Then let me believe enough for both of us," he said against her skin. They slept in fitful bursts, wrapped in each other's arms, the rifle lying between them like a cold iron child. Morning came with the sound of hoofbeats, not the scattered trot of a few horses. but the rhythmic, heavy thunder of a cavalcade. Elias woke instantly. He moved to the crack in the wall. The sun was just cresting the eastern hills, bathing the main street in a bloody red light. They were there, a dozen riders. They wore long dusters and wide-brimmed hats. Their horses were fine thoroughbreds, not the rough mustangs of the range. In the center of the group rode a man on a white stallion. He wore a gray suit that seemed impeccably clean despite the dust. He sat tall, his posture arrogant and relaxed. It was Charles Vance. Elias felt the name taste like bile in his mouth. He watched as the riders dismounted in front of the saloon. Sheriff Thorne, his nose bandaged and his face swollen into a purple mask, walked out to meet them. He pointed a shaking finger toward the barn. Elias turned to Clara. She was standing now, brushing the hay from her dress. She looked terrified, but she was not shaking. She had found that steel core again, the one that had kept her alive in the creek. "They are here," Elias said. "I know. We have to move." He said, "The back door faces the corral. If we can get to the horses, they won't let us leave." "Elias," she said quietly, "we make them." He said, "They moved to the ground floor." Elias kicked the brace off the main doors. He threw them open. The sudden light was blinding. They walked out into the corral. The horses were gone. Thorne had likely confiscated them in the night. They were on foot. "There they are," a voice shouted. Elias raised his rifle, but there were too many of them. Men swarmed from the alleyways, weapons drawn. They were surrounded. In the center of the street, the group of riders turned. Charles Vance walked forward. He was a handsome man, in the way a snake is handsome, sleek, polished, and cold. He held a silver-tipped cane, though he walked without a limp. He stopped 20 paces away, his men fanning out behind him, hands hovering over their holsters. "Clara," Charles said. His voice was smooth, cultured, carrying easily in the morning air. "You look terrible. My dear, the frontier does not suit your complexion." Elias stepped in front of her, the rifle leveled at Charles's chest. "Take another step, and I will kill you." Charles laughed. He looked at Elias with mild amusement. "And you must be a cowboy. The one who likes to hit officers of the law. My name is Elias Holloway." "I didn't ask for your name," Charles said dismissively. "You are holding my property. Mr. Holloway. I would like it back." "She is not property," Elias snarled. Charles sighed. He tapped his cane against his boot. "She is a thief. She stole $5,000 in bonds. She is a blackmailer. And, if the rumors are true, she is now a whore who spreads her legs for crippled ranchers to pay her way." The town had gathered, men, women, children. They stood on the porches and behind rain barrels, watching. They heard the insult. It hung in the air like smoke. Elias tightened his finger on the trigger. The rage was a white-hot sun in his chest. He was going to kill him. He was going to put a bullet through that silk tie and watch the arrogance drain out of him. He shifted his stance. "No!" Clara screamed. She threw herself in front of Elias, blocking his aim. She stood between the two men, her arms spread wide. "Move! Clara!" Elias shouted. She ignored him. She faced Charles. She faced the town. She faced the sheriff who had called her a whore. She stood tall, her chin lifted, her eyes blazing with a fire that made Charles take a half-step back. "Tell them, Charles," she said. Her voice rang out, clear and strong. "Tell them what I stole." Charles sneered. "You know what you took." "I took my body back," Clara screamed. The silence in the street was absolute. Even the horses seemed to freeze. "Tell them," she continued, walking toward him. "Tell them how you came into my room. Tell them how you held me down. Tell them how I begged you to stop and you laughed. Tell them that the only thing I stole was the breath in my lungs when I ran from you." She turned to the crowd. She looked at the women on the porch. "He forced himself on me," she cried. "And when I ran, he didn't send the law. He sent killers. He sent men to shoot a woman in the back because his pride was hurt. There are no bonds. There is no money. There is only a man who cannot stand that I said no." She pointed a trembling finger at Charles. "You are not a victim. Charles, "You are a monster." The crowd shifted. The women looked at each other. The men looked at their boots. The accusation hung there, raw and bleeding. Truth has a sound, distinct from lies. It has a resonance. Clara's voice had that resonance. Charles's face hardened. The mask slipped. For a second, the cruelty beneath the charm was visible to everyone. His lip curled. "She is hysterical." Charles said cold and sharp, "She is mad. Sheriff, arrest her." The sheriff hesitated. He looked at Clara, then at Charles. He looked at the crowd. He saw the doubt in their eyes. "I said arrest her," Charles barked. "Or do you want the railroad to forget where your pension comes from? Money, it always came back to money." The sheriff's shoulders slumped. He gestured to his deputies. "Take them," Thorne muttered. Elias saw the movement. He saw the deputies raising their rifles. He saw the smirk return to Charles's face. The truth didn't matter. Not here. Not when the law was in a rich man's pocket. Elias grabbed Clara by the waist. He didn't ask. He hauled her backward, toward the livery stable where 2 fresh horses were tied to the rail, horses that didn't belong to them, but belonged to the railroad men. "Run!" Elias yelled. He fired a shot into the dirt at the deputies' feet. They scrambled for cover. Chaos erupted. Elias threw Clara onto the back of a chestnut mare. He vaulted onto the black stallion beside it, ignoring the scream of protest from his bad knee. "Stop them!" Charles screamed. "Shoot them!" Gunfire cracked the morning air. Bullets whizzed past them like angry hornets. Elias slapped the rump of Clara's horse. The mare bolted. They tore down the main street, dust exploding under the hooves. A bullet shattered the window of the barber shop as they passed. Elias turned in the saddle and fired 2 shots back toward the saloon, not aiming to kill, but to keep their heads down. They galloped past the last house, past the sign that read Bitter Creek, and out onto the open plain. The wind whipped their faces. Behind them, the shouts and the gunfire faded, replaced by the thunder of their own flight. They didn't look back. They rode for the rise of the land, for the jagged teeth of the mountains in the distance. They rode away from the law and the lies, into the wild, unforgiving emptiness that was the only freedom they had left. The mountains did not welcome them. They tolerated them, with the cold indifference of stone and ancient ice. Elias and Clara rode the stolen horses until the animals were lathered and blowing hard, their breath pluming in the thinning air like smoke signals of distress. They had left the high plains behind, climbing steadily into the jagged spine of the Wind River Range, seeking the only cover that offered a chance against the posse that might still be tracking them. The weather turned with the brutal suddenness of the high country. The sky, which had been a hard, clear blue at dawn, curdled into a bruised heavy gray by midday. The wind picked up, stripping the last of the gold aspen leaves from the trees and sending them skittering across the rock like terrified coins. By late afternoon, the smell of snow was thick in the air, a sharp, metallic scent that burned the back of the throat. Elias swayed in the saddle. He had been riding on instinct for the last 10 miles, his vision blurring at the edges. The graze on his ribs from the escape was not deep, but the exposure and the sheer, crushing weight of exhaustion had taken a toll his body could no longer pay. His bad knee throbbed with a rhythm that matched the dull pounding in his skull. "We have to stop," Clara shouted over the wind. Her voice was snatched away almost instantly, but Elias saw the shape of the words. He nodded, though looking for shelter felt like searching for a needle in a haystack of granite. But luck, or perhaps providence, offered them a sliver of mercy. Nestled in a fold of the mountain, protected by a stand of lodgepole pine, sat a structure. It was hardly a house. It was a trapper's cabin, abandoned years ago by the look of the sagging roofline and the door that hung on a single leather hinge. They rode into the clearing. The first flakes of snow began to fall, fat and wet, hissing as they hit the warm necks of the horses. Elias slid from the saddle and his legs simply folded beneath him. He hit the frozen ground hard. "Elias!" Clara was there in an instant, her hands gripping his coat, pulling him up. "I am fine," he slurred, the lie thick on his tongue. "Just slipped." He was burning. even through his heavy duster and the gloves she wore. Clara could feel the heat radiating from him. His skin was gray, his eyes glassy and unfocused. "Get inside," she ordered, her voice finding that steel edge again. She guided him into the cabin. It was dark, smelling of rat droppings and old soot, but it was out of the wind. There was a stone hearth, choked with debris, and a rough bunk built into the wall. Clara helped him to the bunk, where he collapsed, shivering so violently his teeth clicked together. She did not rest. She went back out into the rising storm to unsaddle the horses and turn them loose in the lean-to, praying they would find enough dried grass to stay close. She gathered what wood she could find, broken branches, dry pine needles, and returned to the cabin. The fire took time to coax, but eventually, a small, smoky flame began to lick at the darkness. The light revealed the starkness of their situation. They had the saddlebags, a half-eaten sack of beans, a tin of coffee, and the rifle. Outside, the world was turning white. By midnight, the storm was a howling beast tearing at the logs. Inside, the battle was quieter but far more desperate. Elias was lost in the fever. He tossed on the hard planks of the bunk, muttering names of men long dead, giving orders to soldiers who could not hear him. "Samuel," he gasped, gripping Clara's wrist with bruising force. "Samuel, get down! The ridge is too exposed." "I am here," Clara whispered, wiping his forehead with a rag she had soaked in snow. "It is Clara. You are safe." He did not hear her. He was back in the mud of the war, or the dust of the feud. He thrashed, crying out in pain, his body fighting an enemy she could not shoot. For 3 days, the snow fell. It piled up against the door, sealing them in a tomb of ice and timber. The supplies dwindled. The beans ran out on the second day. Elias could not eat solid food, but he needed broth. He needed strength. Clara looked at the rifle leaning against the wall. She had never hunted game. She had seen men do it, had seen the carcasses hung in the butcher shop, but she had never been the one to pull the trigger on a living thing for food. She had no choice. On the morning of the 4th day, the snow stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Clara wrapped herself in Elias's heavy coat, which swallowed her small frame, and took the Winchester. She stepped out into a world that was blindingly white and terrifyingly vast. The cold bit through the wool instantly, sharp as a knife. She waded through knee-deep drifts, scanning the tree line. She walked for an hour, her breath burning in her lungs. She found tracks, a snowshoe hare, likely. She followed them into the dense pines. When she saw the animal, frozen in stillness against the bark of a fallen log, she did not hesitate. She raised the heavy rifle, ignoring the ache in her own healing shoulder, and fired. The recoil bruised her, but she did not drop the gun. She walked to the animal, picked it up by the ears, and felt the warmth of its blood on her mittens. She did not look away. She carried it back to the cabin, her jaw set. She skinned it with Elias's belt knife, her movements clumsy but determined. She boiled the meat in snow water, making a rich, dark broth. She fed it to him spoon by spoon. He was too weak to lift his head, so she cradled him against her chest, murmuring soft words as he swallowed. "You have to live," she whispered into his hair, which was damp with sweat. "You promised me a valley. You promised me wildflowers. You cannot break a promise to a lady." Elias Holloway. That night, the fever broke. It happened in the dark hours before dawn. Elias woke with a gasp, as if surfacing from deep water. The shivering had stopped. The heat in his blood had cooled to a dull ache. He blinked, trying to make sense of the shadows dancing on the ceiling beams. "Clara?" he rasped. His voice was a ruin, barely a sound at all. She was there instantly, her hand on his cheek. "I am here. I dreamt," he whispered. "I dreamt of the ranch. The grass was green. Samuel was there. And you were wearing a yellow dress." Clara smiled, though tears were streaming down her face in the dark. "Yellow is not my color. Elias, in the dream. I told you I loved you," he said. The words hung in the cold air, fragile as glass. "I told you over and over. Clara leaned down, resting her forehead against his. "You did," she said softly. "You said it while you burned. You shouted it to the roof." Elias closed his eyes. He turned his face away from her, into the rough wool of the blanket. It was the fever talking. "No," Clara said fiercely. "It was you. It was a lie," he muttered, the self-loathing heavy in his voice. "A man like me. I have no right to love you. I am a cripple, a failure." "I have nothing to give you but a name that is cursed. I am not good enough to be loved back." Clara pulled back. She grabbed his chin and forced him to look at her. Her eyes were fierce in the firelight. "You do not get to decide that," she said. "You do not get to decide what you are worth to me. You saved me. I dragged you into the snow to die," he countered. "You kept me warm," she said. "You fought for me. Now sleep. That is an order." He slept, and this time, his sleep was dreamless and healing. 2 days later, the strength returned to his limbs. It came slowly, like sap rising in a frozen tree. He could sit up. He could eat the meat she stripped from the hair bones. He watched her move around the small cabin, tending the fire, melting snow for water. She looked thinner, her face gaunt, dark circles bruised under her eyes. She had given him everything, every scrap of warmth, every ounce of energy. Guilt gnawed at him, sharper than the hunger. "I need to move," Elias said on the 3rd morning of his recovery. "The air in here. It is stagnant. Don't overdo it," Clara warned. But she did not stop him. He put on his boots, his fingers fumbling with the laces. He took the axe from the corner. It was old and rusted, but the edge was still serviceable. He stepped out into the brilliant, blinding morning. The sun was dazzling on the snow, turning the world into a sheet of diamond dust. The air was crisp, motionless, and incredibly cold. Elias took a deep breath, feeling the freeze expand his lungs. He needed to feel his body working again. He needed to know that he was still a man, capable of providing heat, capable of survival. He found a fallen pine near the cabin, dragged half-buried in the snow. He stripped off his shirt, needing to feel the bite of the air on his skin, needing to shock the last of the sickness out of his system. His torso was lean, scarred, the muscles moving beneath the skin like cords of wire. He swung the axe. Thwack! The sound was loud and satisfying. He swung again. The wood split. He fell into a rhythm. Swing, impact, split, swing, impact, split. Sweat broke out on his back, steaming in the frigid air. The pain in his knee was a dull roar, but he welcomed it. Pain was life. Pain meant he was still standing. He did not hear the door open. He did not know Clara was watching him until he paused to wipe his brow and heard the soft, stifled sound of a sob. He turned. Clara stood in the doorway, wrapped in a blanket. She was looking at him, at the steam rising from his shoulders, at the pile of wood growing at his feet. She was crying, silent, shaking tears that tracked down her pale cheeks. "Clara." Elias dropped the axe. He walked toward her, not caring about the cold. "What is it? Are you hurt?" She shook her head, unable to speak. He reached her and pulled her into his arms, her face pressed against his bare chest, the cold of her nose sharp against his hot skin. "I was going to leave," she sobbed into him. "Before the snow, before we left town, I had it all planned. I was going to take the mare and drive west. I was going to leave without saying goodbye." Elias stroked her hair, his hand large and rough against the silk of it. "Why?" "Because I thought I was saving you," she cried, pulling back to look at him. "I figured if I left, the trouble would leave me. I thought you would be better off without the stain of me on your life." "And now?" Elias asked gently. She looked at him, at the life in his eyes, at the strength in his arms, at the sheer, stubborn reality of him standing half-naked in the snow simply because he could. "Now I know that leaving would have killed us both," she whispered. "I saw you on that bunk. Elias, I saw you slipping away, and I realized that I would rather freeze to death beside you than live 100 years in a palace without you." Elias looked down at her. The cold was forgotten. The world narrowed down to the woman in his arms. "Come inside," he said hoarsely. He led her back into the dim warmth of the cabin. He barred the door against the white world. He threw the fresh wood on the fire, sending sparks rushing up the chimney. He turned to her. She let the blanket fall from her shoulders. She stood before him in her simple cotton shift, shivering, but not from cold. "Elias," she whispered. He went to her. He did not rush. There was no urgency of escape this time, no frantic need to prove they were alive. There was only the slow, heavy gravity of love. He touched her face, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw, the curve of her ear. "You are beautiful," he said. It was a simple statement of fact, as true as the mountains outside. She reached for the buttons of her shift. He stopped her hands with his own. "Let me," he said. He undressed her slowly, reverently, when she was bare in the firelight. He looked at her with a gaze that made her feel sacred. He saw the scar on her shoulder where the bullet had grazed her. He leaned down and pressed his lips to it. A kiss of benediction. They moved to the narrow bunk. He covered them with the furs and the wool. He moved over her, his weight a familiar, grounding comfort. They made love with a tenderness that was almost painful. It was a conversation without words, a language of skin and breath. Every touch was a promise. Every kiss was an apology for the years they had spent apart. Not knowing the other existed, it was slow, a deep, rhythmic tide that pulled them under. Elias buried his face in the curve of her neck, inhaling the scent of her, pine smoke, sweat, and woman. He felt the walls around his heart, the ones he had built brick by brick since the day Samuel died, crumbling into dust. He felt exposed, flayed open, and completely, terrifyingly whole. When the crest came, it was not a shout, but a shudder that went through them both, a binding of souls that left them clinging to each other in the aftermath, shattered and rebuilt. They lay in the silence, the fire popping softly. Elias kept his arm around her, his hand resting on her hip. Clara traced patterns on his chest with her fingertip. One kiss. "No more," she murmured, a smile in her voice. Elias chuckled, a low rumble in his chest. "You are a terrible liar. Clara Monroe, I told myself that," she said, her voice becoming serious. "That first night in the cabin, I told myself, just one, just to taste it, just to know what I was missing. I thought I was too broken for anything else. I thought my heart was just shards of glass." She propped herself up on her elbow and looked down at him. Her hair fell around them like a curtain, shielding them from the rest of the room. "But you," she whispered, touching his cheek. "You didn't care about the cracks. You didn't try to fix me. You just loved me. You kissed the part of me that wasn't broken." The words hit Elias like a physical blow. He looked up at her, at the love radiating from her face, and something inside him finally let go. The dam he had held against the grief, the stoicism of the Western man, the hardness of the soldier. It all broke. His face crumpled. A sob ripped its way out of his throat. A raw, jagged sound. "Elias?" Clara whispered, alarmed. He couldn't stop. The tears came, hot and fast, burning his eyes. He wept for Samuel, buried alone under the cottonwood. He wept for the years he had wasted in silence. He wept for the child he had been before the war, and for the man he had become. He wept because he was loved, and he finally believed he deserved it. Clara did not tell him to hush. She did not look away. She pulled his head down to her chest and held him. She stroked his hair and rocked him while he cried, absorbing his grief into her own body, carrying the weight he had carried alone for so long. He cried until he was empty, until the well was dry. When he finally lay back, exhausted, his eyes swollen, he felt lighter than air. The ghost that had haunted him for 5 years was gone, washed away by the salt of his own tears. "Thank you," he whispered. Clara kissed his forehead. "Sleep now." The next morning, the world was calm. The sun was bright, the sky a vivid, impossible blue. The snow lay deep and pristine, covering the scars of the land. They stood outside the cabin, watching the horses paw at the snow to get to the grass beneath. They were dressed for travel. "We can't stay here," Elias said. "The food is gone, and the winter will only get worse." Clara nodded. "Where do we go? West? To the coast?" Elias looked at her. He looked at the direction of the mountains. Then he turned and looked back the way they had come. Back toward the plains, back toward the valley, back toward the ranch. He thought of the handbill. He thought of Charles Vance and his smirk. He thought of the sheriff and the law that was bought and paid for. Then he thought of the fence he had mended. He thought of the bread baking in the oven. He thought of the grave under the tree. "We don't go west," Elias said. Clara looked at him, her eyes widening. "We go back," Elias said firmly. "To the ranch?" Clara asked. "Elias, they will kill us." "No," he said, "they will try. But that is my land. That is our land. I am done running. Clara, I am done letting men like Vance decide where I can sleep and who I can love." He turned to her, taking her gloved hands in his. "We go back," he said, his voice steady as the rock beneath their feet. "We go back and we fight. We fight for the land. We fight for your name. And we fight for this." He gestured between them. "I want to live without shame. Clara, I want to kiss you on my front porch in the middle of the day and let the whole damn territory see it." Clara stared at him. She saw the fear in his eyes. Yes, but she saw something else too. She saw the soldier again. She saw the man who had stood against a rattlesnake. She saw a future that was dangerous, terrifying, and worth everything. She squeezed his hands. "Okay," she said. Her voice was clear. "Okay, we go back." Elias nodded. He helped her onto the mare. He swung himself into the saddle of the stallion. He checked the rifle in the scabbard. It was fully loaded. They turned the horses toward the east, toward the rising sun, toward the fight of their lives. They rode down from the mountain, leaving the sanctuary of the snow behind, riding back into the fire. The snow melted slowly, retreating up the slopes of the Wind River Range like a defeated army surrendering the high ground. What was left behind was a world of mud and raw, brown earth. But to Elias and Clara, it looked like promise. They rode down from the timberline in silence, the horses picking their way carefully through the slush. They were thinner than they had been weeks ago, their face hollowed by the cold and the scarcity of food. But there was a fire in their eyes that the winter had failed to extinguish. They crossed the boundary of the Holloway Ranch at midday. The fence line Elias and Clara had repaired stood straight against the horizon, a testament to their labor. The house was dark and cold, the windows staring out like empty sockets, but it was still standing. The railroad men had not burned it. Perhaps they had been too arrogant to believe Elias would ever return to claim it, or perhaps the early winter storms had driven them off before they could strike the match. Elias dismounted near the porch. He tied the black stallion to the rail and helped Clara down. She landed heavily, her boots sinking into the soft earth. She looked at the house, then at the cottonwood tree by the creek where Samuel was buried. "We are back," she whispered. Elias checked the door. It was unlocked, pushed open by the wind. Snow had drifted into the front room and melted, warping the floorboards near the threshold. He walked in, his spurs chiming in the silence. He checked the corners, the loft, the back room. It was empty. The rats had returned, but the ghosts, the heavy, suffocating presence of his grief, seemed to have fled. He walked back out to the porch. Clara was standing by the railing, looking south toward the town. "They will know we are here soon enough," Elias said. "Smoke from the chimney will be seen for miles." "Let them see," Clara said. She reached into the bodice of her dress. She flinched slightly as she worked at the seam of her undergarments, ripping the stitching with her fingernails. Elias watched her, confused. "Clara, I told you I didn't steal his money," she said, her voice trembling with the effort. And that was the truth. I never took a single gold eagle from Charles Vance, but I did take something. She pulled a folded, oilskin-wrapped packet from the lining of her corset. It was warm from her skin, flat and dense. She held it out to Elias. "What is this?" he asked, taking it. "Insurance," she said. "I sewed it the night I ran. I didn't tell you because I was afraid. I was afraid that if you saw it, you would think I really was a thief. And I was afraid that if Charles knew I still had it, he wouldn't just kill me. He would torture me." Elias unwrapped the oilskin. Inside were papers, pages torn from a ledger, written in a tight, cramping hand. and a bundle of letters signed by the territorial surveyor. He read the first page. His eyes narrowed. He read the second. His hands began to shake, not from cold, but from a sudden, volcanic rage. "This is the survey report," Elias said, his voice low and dangerous. "The original survey." "Read the letter underneath." Clara said. Elias read it. It was a correspondence between Charles Vance and the head of the land office, detailing a scheme to declare the water sources on the valley ranches as railroad eminent domain due to falsified drought records. It was a detailed map of theft. It showed how they had targeted Samuel's land specifically, marking it as uninhabited 2 months before Samuel was even shot. "He killed him," Elias whispered. "He didn't just hire men to shoot him in a dispute. He planned it. He erased Samuel from the map before the bullet ever left the gun." Clara nodded, tears standing in her eyes. "Charles kept everything. He was too proud to destroy the proof of his own cleverness. He called it his victory log. When I found it, I knew I had to take it. It is the only thing he fears." Elias looked at her. He looked at the woman who had endured the shame of being called a thief and a whore to protect a sheaf of papers that could save a valley. "We are not just fighting for the ranch," Elias said, folding the papers carefully. "We are going to hang him." They did not wait for the sheriff to come to them. The next morning, dressed in their cleanest clothes, which were stiff with dust and wear, they rode not to Bitter Creek, but past it. They rode 3 days south to the territorial capital, to the district courthouse. Elias knew the reputation of Judge Thaddeus Sterling. He was a man from the East who had come west with a Bible in one hand and a law book in the other. He was known to be severe, humorless, and utterly immune to bribes. He was the only man in the territory Charles Vance had not been able to buy. Elias filed the counterclaim the moment the clerk's office opened. He slapped the oilskin packet on the desk with a sound like a gunshot. He demanded a hearing. When the clerk tried to wave him off, citing the railroad schedule, Elias leaned over the desk and spoke with the quiet, terrifying intensity of a man who has survived the winter. "You will take this to the judge," Elias said, "or I will take it to the newspapers." The hearing was set for 2 days later. Word traveled fast on the telegraph wires. By the time the sun rose on the day of the hearing, the courtroom was packed. The townsfolk from Bitter Creek had ridden down, driven by curiosity and the scent of scandal. Sheriff Thorne was there, looking uncomfortable in his dress uniform, his nose still crooked from Elias's fist, and Charles Vance was there. He sat at the plaintiff's table, flanked by 2 lawyers in expensive wool suits. Charles looked bored. He picked at his fingernails, occasionally glancing at the gallery with a sneer. When Elias and Clara walked in, a hush fell over the room. They walked down the center aisle. Elias walked with his limp, heavy and rhythmic. Clara walked beside him, her head high. She wore a simple gray dress they had bought with the last of their coin. She wore no hat. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. They took their seats at the defense table. There was no lawyer with them. Elias laid his hat on the table and sat with his hands folded. "All rise," the bailiff bellowed. Judge Sterling swept in, a hawk of a man with white mutton chops and eyes like polished coal. He sat down, arranged his robes, and glared at the courtroom over his spectacles. "This is a special hearing regarding the matter of the Union Pacific claim against the Holloway estate and the counter-accusations of fraud and larceny." Sterling boomed. "Mr. Vance, you claim the woman sitting there stole $5,000 in bonds." "I do, Your Honor," Charles said, standing up smoothly. "She was a domestic in my household who took advantage of my kindness. She seduced my son, gained access to the safe, and fled. The man with her is an accomplice." "And you, Elias Holloway," Sterling said, turning his gaze to the rancher. "You claim this is a lie? I claim it is a fabrication to cover a murder," Elias said. His voice carried to the back of the room. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The judge banged his gavel. "Evidence." "Mr. Holloway," Sterling demanded, "the court does not deal in stories. It deals on paper." Clara stood up. Elias reached for her hand, but she squeezed his fingers and let go. She walked to the witness box. She placed her hand on the Bible. She swore to tell the truth. She looked at Charles. He was smiling at her. That same cold, possessive smile he had worn the day he cornered her in his study. "Tell the court what you took. Miss Monroe," the judge said. "I took the ledger of the Vance family trust," Clara said clearly. Charles's lawyer jumped up. "Objection! That is private property." "Overruled," Sterling snapped. "Continue." Clara reached into the satchel Elias had brought. She pulled out the ledger pages. She handed them to the bailiff, who passed them to the judge. These pages detail the payments made to the Bitter Creek Land Office. Clara said, she turned to the crowd, speaking not just to the judge but to the people who had shunned her. They show bribes paid to surveyors to alter the water maps. They show payments made to Sheriff Thorne to ignore complaints of harassment. And they show a payment of $200 to a man named Cyrus Miller on the 14th of August, 1870. The room went deadly silent. Everyone in Bitter Creek knew Cyrus Miller. He was a hired gun who had disappeared 5 years ago. Elias stood up. August 14th was the day my brother Samuel was shot. Charles Vance's face lost its color. He stood up, knocking his chair over. "This is ridiculous. She forged them. She is a liar and a thief. Sit down." "Mr. Vance," Judge Sterling roared. The judge adjusted his glasses. He read the papers in silence. The ticking of the wall clock sounded like hammer strikes. He picked up the letters. He compared the signatures. He looked at the seal of the land office. He looked up at Charles Vance. The boredom was gone from Charles's face, replaced by a sheen of sweat. "These documents bear the official stamp of the Surveyor General," Sterling said, his voice icy. "And this letter, signed by you, Mr. Vance, explicitly instructs your men to, and I quote, remove the Holloway problem by any means necessary." The judge looked at the sheriff. "Sheriff Thorne arrests Mr. Vance." Thorne froze. He looked at Charles, then at the judge. "Now, Sheriff," Sterling shouted, "or I will have the U.S. Marshals take you into custody alongside him." Thorne moved. He walked to the plaintiff's table. Charles backed away, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped rat. "You cannot do this!" Charles screamed. "Do you know who my father is? I own this town. I own all of you." Thorne grabbed his arm. Charles swung his cane, striking the sheriff in the shoulder. But 2 deputies rushed in, tackling him to the floor. The man who had looked so untouchable in the snowy street of Bitter Creek was dragged kicking and screaming from the courtroom, his expensive gray suit coated in the dust of the floor. Judge Sterling turned back to the room. The claim against the Holloway Ranch was dismissed with prejudice. He ruled, "The warrant for Clara Monroe is vacated, and I'm ordering a federal investigation into the Bitter Creek Land Office." He looked at Clara. She was still standing in the witness box, gripping the rail. "You are a brave woman. Miss Monroe," the judge said softly. "You are free to go." Clara let out a breath she felt she had been holding for months. Her knees buckled, but Elias was there. He caught her. He held her upright as the gavel banged, signaling the end of the war. They walked out of the courthouse and into the afternoon. The sky had opened up while they were inside. A soft, steady spring rain was falling, washing the dust from the streets. It smelled of wet earth and green grass. The townsfolk were waiting on the steps. They did not jeer. They did not whisper. The women who had pulled their skirts aside when Clara passed now looked at her with something approaching awe. The men touched the brims of their hats as Elias walked by. They knew what it took to stand against the railroad. They knew that the woman hanging onto the rancher's arm had done what none of them had dared to do. Elias stopped at the bottom of the steps. He turned his face up to the rain, letting it cool the heat of the courtroom from his skin. He looked at Clara. Her hair was plastered to her cheeks, but she was smiling. It was a true smile, one that reached her eyes and stayed there. "It is over," Elias said. "No," Clara corrected him, taking his hand. "It is just starting." They rode back to the ranch under a sky that was slowly clearing. The rain had turned the plains into a patchwork of green. The drought had broken, truly broken, along with the power of the Vance family. The work that followed was hard, But it was a joyful kind of labor. They rebuilt the ranch not as it was, but as it could be. They tore down the leaning bunkhouse and used the wood to expand the main cabin. They bought new stock with the credit the bank was suddenly eager to extend to them. Spring turned to summer. The valley exploded with color. The wildflowers Elias had promised her in the dark of the barn appeared, wild blue flax, Indian paintbrush, and yellow columbine growing thick along the creek banks. On a hot afternoon in July, they gathered by the corral fire. It was branding day. The new calves were wrestled down one by one. Elias pulled the iron from the coals. It glowed a cherry red. He looked at the iron. For 3 generations. It had been a simple block H. He handed the iron to the blacksmith he had hired. "Change it," Elias said. The smith looked at him. "Change the brand. Boss, that is bad luck. Not this time," Elias said. He took a piece of chalk and drew on the fence post. He drew the block H, but interlaced with it, strong and equal, was the letter C. The smith grinned and went to work. When the first calf was branded with the new mark, Clara stood by the fence, watching. She wore a work dress, her hands gloved, her face brown from the sun. She looked at the smoke rising from the flank of the calf, carrying the smell of singed hair and victory. Elias walked over to her. He wiped the soot from his hands on a rag. "It looks good," she said, nodding at the brand. "It looks right," he said. He climbed over the fence and stood beside her. The sun was beginning to dip toward the western peaks, setting the sky on fire with streaks of violet and gold. The cattle were lowing in the pasture. The creek was running full and loud. Clara turned to him. She reached up and took his hat off, tossing it onto a fence post. She ran her fingers through his hair, which was graying at the temples, but thick and soft. "You have ash on your face," she said. Elias smiled. "I am a rancher. Clara, dirt is part of the uniform, and I am a rancher's wife." She said, "Or I will be, as soon as the preacher rides through next week." Elias wrapped his arms around her waist. He pulled her close, until there was no air between them. He felt the steady thump of her heart against his chest. He looked at her lips, at the small scar on her chin, at the light in her green eyes that had saved his life. He leaned down. His breath hitched. His heart thundered just as it had that first night in the storm. But there was no fear in it now. Only a gratitude so vast it threatened to bring him to his knees. Clara smiled, a playful glint in her eyes. She stood on her tiptoes. "One kiss. No more," she whispered, the old joke soft between them. Elias laughed, a low sound of pure contentment. He kissed her. It was not brief. It was deep and slow and tasted of rain and wood smoke and forever. He could not stop. He drank her in like water after a long drought. And she did not stop him. She held him tighter, anchoring him to the earth, to the home they had carved out of the wilderness. As dusk fell over the valley, turning the world to soft indigo shadow, they finally broke apart. They rested their foreheads together, breathing in the cool air. They were scarred, they were weathered, and they were standing on land that had tried to kill them a dozen times, but they were standing. They breathed, in love, unafraid, and entirely free. "Thank you so much for listening to this story. One kiss, no more," she said. But when she pulled him down, the rancher forgot to breathe. I hope you enjoyed the journey of Elias and Clara as much as I enjoyed writing it. Please feel free to leave a comment below telling me where you are listening from. I would love to know how far this story has traveled. If you want to hear more tales from the frontier, please subscribe to From Wild West. I look forward to reading your thoughts and sharing the next adventure with you.